here to introduce our next panel. Racial profiling, crimes, espionage, theft of trade secrets are all words, sensational words that are used to headline the stories that frame the topic of our next panel. Unfortunately, and very disturbingly, there is a high frequency of Chinese professionals who are caught up in the snare of criminal investigations regarding the theft of trade secrets. Equally disturbing is that oftentimes China as a country is implicated in those criminal proceedings and investigations. The Committee 100 is very proud to have been in the front of these issues. It was an early supporter of the defense of Wenho Lee, and most recently we have been sponsoring panels on the topic for many Chinese professionals. Among the participants in those panels has been Brian's son. Brian is a partner at Jones Day. He's a litigator in complex litigation, specializes in white-collar crimes, and great fellow member of the Committee 100, and also on the Issues Committee of the committee. Also joining him is the chair of the Issues Committee, Frank Wu. He's Chancellor and Dean of the University of California, Hastings College of the Law. Frank?
Thank you. Thanks so much. It's great to be here with all of you. This is an important subject, one that is much in the headlines. What we thought we would do, Brian is the real lawyer here, so he has the substance. I'll provide the color commentary of sorts. We thought we would ensure that this discussion is practical, that it gives you takeaways in terms of how to think through these issues, how to ensure that trade flows freely and that Chinese Americans don't face undue racial bias. And for those of you who work in high-tech fields where you might have exposure to trade secrets or risks, we really orient this toward you so that you have some sense of how to deal with these possible problems. As Brian and I were talking, I suggested to him there are really three categories of cases. The first are the cases where somebody has done something wrong. It might not be as serious as what the prosecutors say. It might just be a proprietary issue between two companies and not a national security issue. But there are some cases where someone who is accused of wrongdoing, in fact, has done something wrong, it turns out, at the end of the day. Second, there are those cases where people haven't done anything wrong, but they're swept up in the paranoia, in the fear-mongering, in the racial stereotyping, in the profiling, and their own jobs may be put at risk, even though they have nothing to do with any crime of any sort. But for some reason, they fall within a category, perhaps on the basis of ethnicity, where they become targets. And third and finally, there are perhaps ambiguous cases, cases where somebody might be innocent of any intent to do wrong, but maybe they run afoul of arcane and technical import-export laws that they might not be familiar with. They might be business people who don't have the benefit of a sophisticated legal counsel, such as Brian, and one thing leads to another, and then they're in over their heads and wrapped up in a case like this. I thought that for people who might be in that category, that this would be most useful to get a sense of what is the lay of the land, what are the issues, what are the risks, because this is very real. There are cases being prosecuted right now, not just those that are civil in nature, but criminal prosecutions where people, if convicted, will do hard time for what they thought was just good business. So with that, I'll turn things over to Brian. We will have an opportunity for some Q&A and some back and forth. Brian?
Thanks, Frank. If I can use the podium here. This is a subject that's, as many of you know who know me, know that it's near and dear to my heart. And it's also tied very closely to the mission of the Committee of 100. Because as we've heard all day long, you know, part of our mandate or mission of the committee is to improve or foster understanding between U.S. and China and relations and the image of Chinese Americans. And then the second prong is to help support the assimilation and integration of Chinese Americans into the United States in American culture. And among the many threads that we have heard today about business and strategic trust and building bridges and overcoming many of the impediments to that, as China has grown from as someone said earlier today, transformational in one generation to the economic superpower that it is today, you have this negative undercurrent that impacts both aspects of our mission. And that is this growing negativity surrounding perceptions that China is trying to steal American technology and using it to advance it in a way to undermine U.S. security interests. To understand this problem, though, and this presentation is actually a much longer one that the Issues Committee has developed as sort of a speakers bureau that we're delivering in China and all parts of the U.S. to various groups. It is not just directed towards Chinese American professionals. It's directed to their employers, their companies, and also to the Chinese companies in China who are now in the process of trying to recruit much of the talent and knowledge that originally came from China to the United States in the 80s and 90s and in the current decades, and China's now trying to get them to come back. And with the economic wealth and power that China has, as more and more Chinese return to China, they may even be US citizens, to work in Chinese companies, you're seeing this growing tension where American companies are thinking, oh, these guys are going back and they're working for Chinese companies who are owned and operated by the government, state-owned enterprises. And therein lies some of the tension that we see. So I'm going to blow through some of this quickly, but just to give you a sense of the nature of the problem, then we can maybe answer some questions about it if time permits. You know, the Chinese in America, we are here, and the basic thesis here is that of the 4 million ethnic Chinese that live in the United States, we are very educated as a demographic group. And despite all that, as we all know, historically, if you put in this latest chapter of the tension or the challenges of us assimilating into the American culture, we have endured more than a century and a half, arguably, of bias, racism, misunderstanding that has now sort of manifested itself today in its current form in a way that I'm going to talk about in a moment. But to understand the context, sort of our theory of how this evolved, I think it's important to understand the history of our experience in the United States. We all know about the anti-exclusion laws, the anti-immigration laws from the 19th century, where Chinese were not allowed to emigrate, they were not allowed to vote, they were not allowed to own land, all the kinds of things that you know, may have maybe a paragraph in the U.S. history books, but certainly have significant impact for us. And you know, when you have exclusion acts and things like that, it's not a surprise that when you look at U.S. immigration law and real property law, that you'll find that much of the cases that involve exclusions and prejudice involve Chinese American challenges to existing statutes and laws that existed up through the 1940s and 50s. Then following World War II, following a brief period where China was embraced by the U.S. as an ally against the Japanese in World War II, we of course have the emergence of Communist China. And in the 50s, we saw the Red Scare with McCarthy and the House on Un-American Activities, and this whole era where Chinese Americans were under surveillance, San Francisco, elsewhere. The FBI was infiltrating Chinese community groups in the theory that they were, of course, agents of a foreign hostile regime. The media painted it up, and so you had to deal with that kind of thing. And I know some of the younger generation probably don't know or feel or remember it, but it was clearly something that extended itself well into the 1960s. Then we have what I call the latest generation of issues that are directed towards Chinese Americans. Many of you will remember that in the late 1990s, there was significant attention given by the Congress and the Department of Justice to the notion that China was trying to undermine our political process by donating money to national presidential campaigns, mostly the Democrats, to influence those elections and perhaps influence U.S. policy. There was the Buddhist nun case, Johnny Chung, and a host of others that came into the limelight in the late 90s. Then in 1999 came the Cox report. Christopher Cox from California had a committee that issued a report that made some very, very disturbing findings or conclusions that I think can be sort of the genesis of the problems that we face here today. This was a select committee report that grew out of allegations that were made out of the Wenho Lee case, which is a whole separate discussion. I urge you to Wikipedia it or whatever it is that people do nowadays to get a sense and flavor of Dr. Lee's experience. But it grew out of a 1998 article in the New York Times written by Jeff Gerf, who happened to be the guy who also started Whitewater and the Wenho Lee case. But this is an article about how the Chinese had somehow influenced Loral Space Communications and how they had influenced the Clinton administration about selling sensitive satellite technology to the Chinese. That was what spawned the Cox Committee investigation, which later led to Wenho Lee, and which has now been, in my view, the genesis of the American phobias, if you will, about the notion of Chinese governmental interests or quasi-governmental interests stealing U.S. technology. And one of the focus here that we try to keep in mind is the number of Chinese students who have come from China over the last several decades, and even in the last several years, the exponential growth, where almost 30% of the foreign students studying in the United States are from China. And many of them are seeking advanced degrees. Many of them are brilliant researchers and scientists. And it'll be an interesting struggle between the two countries to see where do they go? Where do they go? Who will get the benefit of this know-how? All right. Now, the current geopolitical situation is such now that you have very well-known and counterintelligence organizations and whatever saying things like the China's intelligence services, as well as private companies and other entities, frequently seek to exploit Chinese citizens or persons with family ties to China who can use their insider access to corporate networks to steal trade secrets using removable media devices or email. And that's the context that we find ourselves in today. A perception by the U.S. government and American business that China is actively in the process of stealing their technology. Now, is it because China wants to compete, or is China just doing what the Germans and the French and the Brits do? Try to get the best know-how, hire the best researchers so that they can be competitive with the rest of the world. Is the fact that it's a state-owned enterprise make it part of some plot, sinister plot by the Ministry of State Security to steal American technology? I think not. I just think it's economic competition at its basic level, and yet Americans are, I think, or at least the government is reacting to it in a way that suggests that China is out to undermine U.S. security interests. Cybercrime is now the big thing also that the U.S. government is looking at. Now, the legal environment in the United States is such that espionage, which the Webster Dictionary describes as the practice of spying or using spies to obtain information about the plans and activities, especially of a foreign government or a competing company. That definition, broad that it is and seems, is definitely being applied in this context. And you start with the Wenho Lee case. In those cases, those involved national security cases, classified information, defense secrets, if you will. That began sort of in the late 90s. And now they have morphed into a more, I will say, generic espionage, economic espionage, that doesn't necessarily involve national security-related information, but involves technology involving research of, say, cancer drugs, the latest medical imaging devices, things of that nature that affect big, big business. Against this background, the U.S. has a pretty complex criminal and civil enforcement scheme designed to try to protect against parties that are seeking to surreptitiously or unlawfully obtain someone's proprietary intellectual property. They are espionage, economic espionage laws, the first of which has to do more with national security information. The economic espionage laws, which have more to do with what happens between companies that are not necessarily engaged in sensitive military-related activities. Export control laws, where the United States seeks to regulate the export of technology to foreign countries. So, for instance, there was a recent case in Las Vegas where 2 Chinese citizens were arrested for allegedly buying night vision goggles and then transshipping them to Iran in violation of supposedly the Trading with the Enemy Act and the export regulations laws, because of the notion that the Chinese knew that these goggles would be earmarked for a country that the United States didn't want these night vision goggles sent to, even though these very same type of night vision goggles could have been bought in France or Britain or even Italy by those same folks and shipped to Iran, okay? And sometimes these night vision goggles or these types of equipments aren't even state-of-the-art. But the US government will tag that particular device, in this case night vision goggles, with having both a civilian and military application, and for that reason they can proscribe and regulate the export and sale of those types of products. So and some would argue that, at least from the Chinese perspective, this is a very arrogant view by the US in how they treat the technology. There's also computer crime laws, very, very broad computer designed to deter people from downloading on a flash drive huge amounts of information and then taking with them to another company. Now, I'm going to, because in the interest of time, we should just go probably to some of the examples of this. This is just a sample of the companies that are being affected by these types of issues, where you have, and you see there for Boeing, I'm going to talk about one case involving Boeing, and most recently in San Francisco, there was a Chinese-American U.S. citizen who was convicted of allegedly not allegedly, he was convicted of stealing trade secrets from DuPont to give to a Chinese governmental entity or a connected entity. So that's the kind of pattern you see involving some of America's biggest companies. You have, and that, in fact, this is that case, where both a Chinese American and a U.S. Citizen were convicted recently. There's another case, and this one I brought up here. It's involving 2 Lilly scientists who allegedly stole $55 million in trade secrets. That's what the headline was when the charge was brought last fall. Just last Thursday, and these 2 scientists, both Chinese Americans, both U.S. citizens, both who have families who live in Indiana and roots in Indiana, were held without bail for over 6 months. And at the time of the initial bail hearing, the prosecutor said to the court, these guys are traitors. Traitors, because they were taking Eli Lilly's supposed trade secrets regarding cancer research drugs to give to a competing Chinese company based in Jiangsu province. Well, just last Thursday, the judge issued an order authorizing their release so they could go home for at least home detention for bail. And he basically said that the government overstated their case, that in their latest indictment, they took out all the trade secret theft charges and redefined the property as, quote unquote, Lilly property, far less than being a trade secret. But the hysteria surrounding this theft of technology stuff, which got trumped up into a big deal when this indictment first came out, is the kind of disturbing thing that we want to address in terms of reaching out to everyone, U.S. company and employers, Chinese company employers, the Chinese American or Chinese nationals who work for these companies, to make them more aware that they have to be vigilant on these issues and be careful when they're moving from one company to another. You know, downloading, oh, I did a bunch of work, I don't think it's that important, but you know, work I did, download it on a flash drive, leave and go to your company, you think it's nothing. Well, it could be a lot worse. There's another case in New York involving where Preet Bharara, the U.S. attorney, had a big old press conference about, on the eve, by the way, of the Xi Jinping-Obama summit, where they supposedly charged researchers with a bribery case involving, again, a Chinese medical imaging company. And without getting too much into the details, again, the subsequent indictment that followed the arrest of these gentlemen nowhere near comes near to the exaggerated inflammatory headlines that accompanied the arrest of these three gentlemen. Only one of whom I think will ultimately go to trial in the case. So I do want to talk briefly about this Boeing case. And this is probably one of the saddest cases I have in my 35 years as a lawyer have ever been associated with. This is a former Boeing engineer, Greg Chung, who was convicted of economic espionage. I was engaged to do his appeal, which was unsuccessful. The bottom line is Greg, who is a really good guy, got 15-year sentence for having downloaded a bunch of stuff from Boeing after he retired from Boeing. And the government, amongst 300,000 pages of materials that he had accumulated over the years, had to really stretch to find anything remotely connected to an economic espionage trade secret matter. But he got a 15-year sentence and very likely will pass away in jail given his age. One of the more tragic cases you'll ever come across in this area. I think we should now, before I turn to takeaways, this is going to go both ways. This is not just going to be Chinese Americans prosecuted in the U.S. I brought up the Shui Feng case because this is a Chinese American U.S. citizen who is now currently serving an 8-year jail sentence in the PRC for allegedly stealing state secrets, which so broadly defined, as many of you know, could be the intellectual property of any Chinese company that has a governmental interest or where the government has an interest. And he got an 8-year sentence, and notwithstanding a plea of leniency and clemency by President Obama, the Chinese still have Mr. Shui in jail. You know, the takeaways from this are pretty clear. Okay, we go to our constituents, whether it's the companies themselves or the employees, to be vigilant about, just like you would in a traditional labor and employment context. If you're moving from company A to company B, whether it's a Chinese company or another American company, you got to be careful what you're taking with you. Okay? You always have what's in your brain, but when you start downloading stuff, and it's so easy in this digital age to want to put some stuff on a flash drive and take it with you, or you're thinking about leaving and you want to pitch your talents and ability to another company, so you send them some stuff showing what you've done at your current company. Those are the kinds of things that get you in a lot of trouble, whether it's emails, stuff you send through text messages, or any sorts of electronic devices or ways of communicating. And the bottom line, we're in an environment where you have companies that are very, very sophisticated in how they can detect whether someone has taken something with them. Very, very sophisticated. And that's usually how an investigation starts, and that's usually the heart of the evidence that is brought against people. And the takeaways here are pretty obvious in terms of the impact on both the companies and the individuals. The companies then get themselves in the news. Some of it's negative, some of it's, I can't see any of it being positive. Fines, imprisonment, loss of reputation, deportation in the case of some people, and not to mention, again, for the purposes of the Committee of 100, irreparable harm done to the image of Chinese Americans, because people think, going back to the Cox report, there's 1,000 Chinese companies here who are agents of the MSS, the Ministry of State Security, and they're all acting to try to steal technology and give it back to China. And China hasn't made it any better because they are trying to lure this talent back to China, and understandably so. So they have projects like the 1,000 Talents program. And those of you who know what the 1,000 Talents program is you get awards, stipends, monetary grants. If you are a Chinese national who is now in the United States or in some other country, you get a grant or basically a bonus for coming back to work for a Chinese company. Okay? And that's sort of what we're dealing with in this background. So, I don't know, I hope I blow through this fast enough so we can have some Q&A, but this is the context and the problem and the challenge we're facing right now. And it's a serious issue for the Committee of 100 because we are, think that we have to take an active role in educating and spreading awareness on this issue, because the more we can do to prevent these things, the more we can do to educate everyone about this subject, the fewer of these tragic cases we'll see.
Thanks, Brian. I've been told we're out of time, but there is a version of this talk that Brian and various other C100 members are giving, not just here, but at various places where there's a concentration of people who might need to know about all of this. So if it's something that you'd like to learn more about, or if you'd like Brian or someone else to come and visit you and any of the groups that we might be able to partner with, there's a real opportunity here for C100 to do some good in the world. So thank you, Brian, and thank you so very much.